Okay, I may be interrupted again, but hopefully then I can just pause. But I believe I was taking a little detour to explain a little more about the relationship between Mexica, Mexica, from which the name Mexico comes, and Aztecs. So I want to explain that a little more right now so that when you hear me say Mexica, you know what I'm talking about, even though they come later in this whirlwind tour. So there were no people who called themselves Aztecs at the time. Azteca was the name for a political alliance between three city-states, three different powerful peoples who had as their political and ceremonial centers a state. And the Mexica were arguably the dominant force of this Triple Alliance. So the name, often it was called the Triple Alliance in Nahuatl, but the Triple Alliance. The Triple Alliance was, the name for the Triple Alliance was Azteca. So that was the name for a political alliance, a name for the empire itself, which was a political alliance between these three city-states. But the Mexica were the ones who had their center at Tenochtitlan, and they were arguably the most powerful of the three. But they called themselves Mexica. So the people, the language group, the ethnic group that we'll talk about, you know, that have a particular history coming to Tenochtitlan from the north and establishing themselves first as a very small, not very powerful group of outsiders who were at war with everybody else and eventually ended up rising to power. They are just one of the three political groups, city-states, nations that joined together to form the Triple Alliance, and the name for the Triple Alliance is the Azteca, and so it came to be known the Aztec Empire. So people do talk about Aztecs and Aztec this and Aztec that, and they often, usually, if they are talking about actual people, they probably mean, or are generally referring to the Mexica, who are the people who lived in Tenochtitlan and the people that sat at the seat of power in what is now Mexico City. But they were only one of three political entities that formed the Aztec Empire. So that's why I don't say Aztecs very often. I say the people we've come to know as Aztecs, or I just say Mexica. So the Mexica, I'll probably mostly refer to them as Mexica as we go forward. So I was about to talk about how later, at the time the Spaniards arrived, and in the 100 years before, while the Aztec Empire was at its height, or was actually in existence, Mexica priests wore jaguar skins, and they were doing so in honor of Tlaloc, the rain god. So harkening back to the Mayan and Olmec influences, as well as those of Teotihuacan and the Toltec, who came long before the Mexica, but after the people who actually built Teotihuacan. Okay, so Toltecs were another people that occupied that city, that ceremonial city that I have referred to as Teotihuacan. I know this is way too much to keep in mind. So again, blur out. Just, I'm going to ask you at the end, what are you noticing? What are the similarities? So we've talked about Olmecs, we've talked about Mayans, we've talked about who else have we talked about? We're about to talk about the Zapotec, but we talked about somebody else. Who did we talk about? We've talked about, we haven't really yet talked about the Toltecs, except to say that both the Toltecs and the Mexica, who we will talk about later, found Teotihuacan to be important. Basically, there's, throughout this big period, there are several moments where where these big empires rise and fall, and they're not existing at the same time. You know, their power, because their power extended for a long period of time, they tended not to be at the height of their power at the same time. So we have the Olmecs who rise and fall, and we have Mayans who rise and fall. They coincide with some other more northern places, but again, you know, it's as one is rising, another is falling. Another culture for whom both Tlaloc, the rain god, and Quetzalcoatl are important symbols are the Zapotec in Oaxaca. So that's the other thing that I'm also trying to reveal to you, or sort of highlight for you, is that there are certain symbols that are remarkably consistent. Tlaloc or Choc. Choc is the Mayan word for it. Tlaloc is the Mexica word for it. But a rain god seems to have existed in all these different places, including the Olmec, who are the earliest. And right from the beginning with the Olmec, the rain god was also associated with the jaguar. So the jaguar and rain gods are really important. Quetzalcoatl, a figure that unites the sky and the rain with the earth in the form of a plumed snake, a snake with feathers, has been also in existence from the very beginning of when we can see these large states, at least that long. You know, these images and these symbols may have been important to smaller communities as well, but what we know is that they're important to all of these states. The other thing that we know is that they all seem to, there were ball courts, these sacred ball courts where people played sacred, we call them sacred, they played these ceremonial ball games, which were political and what we would call religious in nature, it seems. Archaeologists tell us, it's always fascinating to me how they know these things, but you know, there's lots you can read about them. But what we think anyways is that in some instances the winners were sacrificed or sacrificed themselves, and in other instances the losers sacrificed themselves. Sometimes it was actual human sacrifice, like they gave up their lives. Sometimes it was more bloodletting sacrifice, but there was some way in which these ball games were a part of humans managing the forces of opposing forces of the universe. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about that for a moment. I'm going to interrupt this tour because I was going to talk about that more with the Mexica, because we know a lot more about that for Mayans, but in particular for the Mexica. But I'll give you an example of what I mean when I say humans managing these forces. You know, keeping the balance of these opposing forces. Apologies. Somebody's trying to FaceTime my daughter. Juggling a lot over here. So, for instance, there was a belief that that every day a battle between night and day happened, and that the sun rising and the moon rising and the night falling and the day falling, or whatever, rising, entailed a constant struggle, between these two forces of birth and death, and of day and night, etc. And it represented all the other opposing forces, but that struggle between day and night took a toll on the earth, which was the center of both death and rebirth, and fertility and all of these things. And so there was a kind of a loss of life force that the earth suffered as a part of this cosmic war, and that humans had made a contract in this era, in the era that people were living in at the time, in that, in the world of the sun, the name of that particular era. And I don't mean era like the way we think of era, like 50 years or 100 years or something like this. The concept that from the beginning of that world, which was the beginning of the world, except that they believed that there had been multiple worlds before that. But in that world that they knew of, the humans had taken on the responsibility to replenish the earth, and how they replenished the earth was literally through blood. So that's what I mean when I say that the when I talk about human sacrifice in that way. And it wasn't always about life. In fact, most often it was about just bloodletting. But like I mentioned before, there were other ways that humans managed the forces, balancing the forces, other more day-to-day ways, and some political, some ritualistic ways that authorities did. But the act of replenishing the earth because of the loss of life force due to the war between these cosmic forces, that was what was done in the form of bloodletting. And so these sacred ball games were a part of that. All right, so the Zapotec in Oaxaca, their great ceremonial and cultural center was called Monte Alban, and by 650 AD, and if you're wanting to map all these things out, we could like make a timeline and looking at who existed when and how they overlapped and things like that. Monte Alban was the dominant religious and cultural force in the region by 650. So like in that region. And so, like other ceremonial centers and cities of Mesoamerica, it had huge pyramids. That's another thing that is common for Mesoamerica, and ball courts, the rain god, and the feathered serpent. Images of those two deities were prevalent in the carvings of that place too. So all over the place. The influence of Monte Alban stretched into the Valley of Mexico, so stretched into where Tenochtitlan was, and into the area around Teotihuacan as well, until about 900 AD. So from the period between 1200 BC and 900 AD, all of these cultures that I have mentioned have left these important legacies. A deep study of heavenly bodies was a part of that legacy. Particular ways of understanding time and history as circular and completing itself in the form of entire worlds that began and then were destroyed and then began again, and that would happen forever. That was a part of that legacy. Symbolic and sacred meanings of numbers was a part of that legacy that stretched throughout Mesoamerica between 1200 BC and 900 AD. A deep reverence for rain as a force of order and as a force of life-giving powers was a part of that, and represented in the form of a jaguar and Chak and Tlaloc, known by other names, I'm sure, as well, but a rain god, representing this reverence for rain. That was a part of that legacy. A deep respect for the creative and destructive and regenerative powers of the earth was a part of all of those cultures and all of that legacy. And a belief in the need for balance of these powers, as especially symbolized by Quetzalcoatl, was a part of that. So Quetzalcoatl, in my mind, is a kind of center of this whole story. The feathered serpent, an image that represented a uniting of these forces of chaos and disorder, a uniting of the forces of the sky and the earth, a bringing into balance the forces of the ordering sky and the gift of rain, which helps continue the both creative and destructive and regenerative powers of the earth. So Quetzalcoatl lies at the heart of this whole way of understanding the world and shows up all over the place throughout this very long period of time. I have here in my notes that I was going to tell you that one thing I have not talked about yet is human sacrifice, except that I have, because I've strayed off topic. But I do want to say something else about it and now move on to talking about the Toltecs. So you read about the sacrifice of blood as well as human life in Inga Clendenin's article. What I want to say is that there's so much controversy about how much human sacrifice was actually practiced, when it started, where it took place, and even if it really happened at all, some people still debate that it's actually difficult to sort through the evidence and the scholarly arguments about it. It does seem clear, and who I trust more than any other scholar is David Carrasco, and this is one of his earlier books, but I still think it's a really, really good one, called Religions of Mesoamerica, Cosmovision and Ceremonial Centers. And I really trust the way he talks about human sacrifice. I think it's a really balanced way of both taking into account the kinds of sources that we have, the very biased sources that we have that we can rely on, with archaeological evidence, which we also interpret in biased ways. He starts that book by just sort of laying out all the fantasies about Mesoamerica, all the colonial fantasies, all the European fantasies, all our own fantasies, just sort of talking about everything we have to sort through in order to understand the evidence. And so by the time you get to actually his arguments about what he does think existed, or the different possibilities, you have a really good sense of what's been distorting our view. So we won't ever know the truth. But what does seem clear is that there was this notion that human beings had to intervene in order to keep the balance between the powerful forces of the universe. And it's clear that this was an important concept in Mesoamerica. And in order to do that, human blood was needed. Literally, human blood was needed. Blood sacrifice could be accomplished without the taking of a human life, but giving of blood was essential. Human blood then was literally reborn within this cosmology into things like corn, new humans, other kinds of life. Blood allowed the earth to produce other kinds of life. Okay. I want to just say, this may sound strange, but is it much stranger than other notions of sacrifice that the Western world is very familiar with, both in Jewish culture, like a long ago Jewish culture? Blood sacrifice was a fundamental part of ritual, not human blood, but animal blood. And then, the whole concept of Jesus of Nazareth dying on the cross, being referred to as the Lamb of God, taking the place of the need for any other kind of sacrifice and atonement, was a similar kind of notion about a sacrifice that was required for human salvation. And so it's a different concept. Again, it relies more on other kinds of ways of thinking about of the supernatural and the natural. But the idea of a sacrifice being required to maintain balance, or to save the world, or to save humans, or to save the planet, however you want to think about it, is not actually very unusual. It's a part of many, many world religions. So also, the other thing that was not very strange for the Spaniards who arrived is that there was also a notion of human blood being converted in the body to things that we now know it doesn't actually get converted into, like breast milk, for instance, and other things. I'll talk more about that later. But there was a notion of blood being generative, and of blood actually being what led to reproduction, that people thought that blood in human bodies, either in hot, dry bodies, which were male bodies, either it was converted to semen; in moist, cool bodies, which were female bodies, it was converted to breast milk. But in both instances, it was thought to carry what we might now call biological traits. And these traits could have to do with behavior, etc., those sorts of things. So though the idea of blood converting into things that give life, and also taking with it ancestry and genealogical notions and traditions, that was something that actually they kind of understood each other about, except that they thought they were doing it in really, really different ways. Also, the concept of a sacrifice was not foreign to the Europeans that arrived, but they understood it differently. I hear her walking around. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, I'm back. All right, back to human sacrifice in this area of time. So to the extent that human sacrifice was practiced, the other thing that seems clear is that it increased with both the power and the instability of these really large states. So it seems that human sacrifice may not have been practiced, or at least not very much, by the Mayans, for instance, until the very end of the Classic period. So you see, a great state rising, and then as it starts to be threatened, we don't know exactly why, are there challenges from below? Are the different small city-states that have been incorporated or are being forced to pay tribute or whatever that are a part of this empire, are they starting to rebel? Is the top starting to topple? At these times and these moments where we can, right before it looks like the decline of these big states, there's more evidence of human sacrifice. So one theory about where actual human sacrifice, where people were actually, human life was taken, where it came from, is that the northern Toltec influence brought human sacrifice increasingly to the Mayans, and then left this legacy for the Mexica to draw upon much later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Toltecs. So around 900 AD, so remember between 1200 BC and 900 AD, all of these cultures that I've talked about before, the Zapotec, Olmecs first, Mayans, Zapotecs, were in power in all these places. We know that Teotihuacan it was very, very old, but we don't know who was there. But around 900 AD, in the beginning of the post-classic period, so after the Mayans had really declined in the height of their power, Toltecs came into the Valley of Mexico from southern Zacatecas. Okay, so the Toltecs came from Zacatecas and into the Valley of Mexico. The story goes that they were led by Mixcoatl, a cloud serpent, who became a divine and mythical warrior. So over a short period of about 60, 70 years, the Toltecs established military dominance in the whole Valley of Mexico. I'm starting to not be able to see through my glasses. Hold on. Sorry for this interlude. Got to get them not smudgy. And they began to stretch their influences far south as the southern Mayan region, changing religious practices, changing some political organization, architecture, language, writing, and even the Mayan calendar starts to showed influence from the northern Toltecs. So the story goes that Mixcoatl's son, Topiltzin, all of these things I'll put on some terms so you can see the spelling of them, became a devotee of Quetzalcoatl. And because of him, the abandoned city of Teotihuacan became an important ceremonial site. So the Toltecs come into the Valley of Mexico. The origin story of this is that they were led by Mixcoatl, a cloud serpent who became a divine warrior, and established dominance in the Valley of Mexico, and stretched their influence all the way south to the southern Mayan region, so really far. And then Mixcoatl's son became a devotee of Quetzalcoatl. And so, Mixcoatl was a human divine figure, right? A lot like maybe the way we think about some of the Greek gods who were half human, half god. So Mixcoatl's son becomes a devotee of Quetzalcoatl, this winged serpent that is, important already all over the enormous region. But Teotihuacan had carvings of Quetzalcoatl, and apparently Quetzalcoatl had been really important to the people that were there before, though nobody really knows who they were exactly. But because of this devotion to Quetzalcoatl, Teotihuacan, which had been abandoned in terms of, nobody was living there, became an important ceremonial site for the Toltecs. So the Toltecs didn't live in Teotihuacan, but used Teotihuacan as an important ceremonial site, and referred to it as Teotihuacan, referred to it as the city of the gods. So that's the beginning of that's the first time we know that Teotihuacan was used ceremony. That's the first time we have evidence of knowing who it was that was using that ceremonial site, but the Toltecs did not build it. They found it, and they knew about these ancient people who had built it, and knew that Quetzalcoatl was important to them. So around 980 AD, the Toltecs build their own ceremonial center of Tula, which also had mythical significance to later the Mexica. So competing factions started to develop in Tula, and wars between them, along with drought and famine, led to the weakening of the city, and the power, therefore, of the Toltecs and their hold on the region. And in 1165, Tula was destroyed by new militaristic immigrants from the north. So, more waves of immigrants from the north come, and then the collapse of Tula allowed waves of these northern people to enter into the Valley of Mexico because there was a power vacuum. Okay. The Mexica were one of these people, one of these groups of people that were militaristic, warring people coming in from the north. Okay. And they arrived on the scene about 1250. So 1165, Tula falls. 1250, the Mexica arrive as just one of these warring waves of people from the north. They spent the first 100 years after their arrival in the Valley of Mexico battling everyone around them. Their histories describe a spiritual vision in which the Valley of Mexico was their promised land. This part some of you may be familiar with. The Mexica said that they came from a mythical birthplace far in the north called Aztlan. Perhaps many people believe, there's lots of archaeological evidence that this might be the case, that Aztlan was located in what is now the southwestern United States or California. The Mexica also claimed that the ancestors of the Toltecs also came from this place, and that the Mexica were descended from the same people that the Toltecs were. That's why the Toltecs are important in this story. So you've got this long history of local small states existing, and these big states rising and falling. And in the Valley of Mexico, and a lot of power in the south, and a lot of power in central, throughout the whole thing. But you've got Teotihuacan as this ancient center that who knows who built. You've got the Toltecs who come in from the north and are saying that they, they most immediately come in from our Zapotec region. And sorry, hold on one second. Gotta attend to something. Sorry, I was distracted by my daughter again. Zacatecas, not Zapotec, sorry. I'll give you a list of terms. And they, establish dominance in the Valley of Mexico. Now, the Mexica are part of these waves of militaristic people coming from the north. They claim to hail from a mythical place called Aztlan. They claim that the Toltecs also hailed from Aztlan. The Toltecs didn't really talk about that in their height, but the Mexica are building on the legacy of the Toltecs, who were building on the legacy of Teotihuacan, and the Mexica are doing the same thing. But their histories tell of having been long ago, their ancestors originating from the same place that the Toltecs originated from, and perhaps even the ancestors of those who built the city of the gods, Teotihuacan, originated from there. That's the vision that shows up in Mexica histories. And they were told that if they left Aztlan and they wandered south, they would find a promised land. And they went here and they went there and they went to all these places, and they found that promised land in the Valley of Mexico. And I'll get back to that in a minute. But you know, they among many other people arrived, and they spent the first 100 years fighting everybody else, fighting the other immigrants to the region, fighting everybody that was there, trying to establish dominance. The way that the stories go, they were committed to doing this because Mexico City, the Valley of Mexico itself, was their promised land, was their rightful place, because they had been told that if they left Aztlan and they went south, they would know the place that was their place when they found a cactus with an eagle eating a snake. So they wandered for many generations by a prophecy that said that they would someday find this promised land, and that in this land they would rise to power, and they would become good stewards of the earth, the sun, and the rain. And they would become the people who would be able to maintain balance. And they would know this place when they saw it, because they would see an eagle with a serpent in its mouth sitting on a cactus. This is so interesting to me because of its relationship to Quetzalcoatl. They didn't find Quetzalcoatl, but they found a bird eating a serpent. They found this relationship between the bird and the snake, representing the unification of sky and earth. And the cactus is an interesting part of it as well. And this is just something I would invite you all to speculate on, what symbol that meant and why that symbol was interjected into all of this. So it seems to me, this is just my opinion, absolutely uninformed really, but it seems to me that this eagle and serpent was a representation of Quetzalcoatl in some way, and also signaled a need for devotion to Tlaloc, the rain god, and the need for human propitiation or sacrifice to ease the thirst of the earth. And I think that the cactus is part of that thirst of the earth. The idea that the desert needs rain, and the earth is thirsty for human sacrifice, for human tending, for human caring in this battle between forces of order and chaos. And an eagle with a snake in its mouth is a less harmonious symbol than the feathered serpent, where those two things are combined in one entity. But nonetheless, it seems to me to represent something in relationship to that. So the Mexica people found this symbol so goes the stories, in the island city of Tenochtitlan. So the Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, was a city in the middle of lakes. So Mexico City is built on a series of lakes, and they had to fill in the lakes. When the Europeans came, it was a city in the middle of lakes, connected with all kinds of canals, and it was this amazing, enormous, beautiful, they had seen nothing like it, in all of Europe, complex, intricate set of cities and markets, and huge temples and all of these sorts of things. But when the Mexica people found this island city of Tenochtitlan, it was a place that was both protected by the surrounding lakes, and also a place where no one really wanted to settle. And because it was hard to live there because it was in the middle of a lake. But by 1350, the Mexica made it their home and made it the place that they sort of, resisted outward and also then began to conquer from. And how they did this is they began dredging the lake bottom to create more surface soil and develop these trade routes, and started to developed these canals and developed these floating gardens, and just created more and more and more soil that was extremely fertile. And as they did so, they started developing trade routes, and they started forming tribute agreements with local authorities of small settlements. And they gradually rose to power, building an enormous, extraordinary city of temples as they did so. So by 1440, they were at the height of their power, religious, cultural, political, however you want to talk about it. They had a loose hold over much of central and southern Mexico, including the Mayan regions. This empire has come to be known as the Aztec Empire, which was the name that the Spaniards gave to it in relation to the term Azteca. The Aztec Empire was in reference, as I've said before, referred to what was understood in Nahuatl as the Triple Alliance. And the Triple Alliance was a military partnership between three cities, and now I'll give you those names. Tenochtitlan, which was ruled by the Mexica, Texcoco, and Tlacopan. But of these three cities and the people that lived in there, and the peoples, which were distinct peoples, but formed a political alliance, Tenochtitlan was dominant, and the Mexica were the people who ruled and inhabited Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan was not just a city that people lived in, and was not just a religious ceremonial site. So it was not really like Teotihuacan, and not even really like Tula. It was much more integrated that way. So the city itself was a representation of Mexica cosmology and religious belief. It was laid out in a very particular way, and because they built it outward, and they laid it out in this way that visually represented a Mexica in particular notion of the world, of how the world worked. The concept of the sacred five directions was central to the layout of the city. Students of Native American traditions often refer to four directions. But in many traditions, and specifically and definitely the case for the Mexica, there was a fifth direction, which was the sacred center, and it was understood as a direction. So the other four directions surrounded, north, south, east, west, the four sacred directions surrounded this fifth sacred direction. And the center was not simply considered a place, a spot, but an actual direction. And that's important. So the architecture of the city, and the canals, and the marketplace, and the temples all reflected this notion of the five directions. It also reflected a complete intertwining of imperial authority and human desire for communication with the sacred, with the more than human, not more than natural, but more than human forces. What we might call divine authority, if you want to talk about it that way. The Mexica vision was one of majesty and intensity, but also a very clear order. Tenochtitlan was built to represent a kind of oneness of nature, what we might call divine forces, and human order and participation. Time and space were inseparable as well. History was measured through the movement of great heavenly bodies and cycles of creation and destruction. Like the Maya, though the Mayas were much more focused on the cosmos than Mexica, but nonetheless, the Mexica adopted Mayan calendars, altered them, but adopted a lot of and took a lot of wisdom and knowledge from the Mayans. Remember, they sat atop a loose empire where they were collecting tribute, etc., and learning from this enormous area and all of these traditions that I mentioned before. So, like the Maya, the Mexica believed that there had been previous ages or worlds, but they referred to them as suns. They believed that they were in the age of the fifth sun, and that its destruction was imminent. So the histories make it sound like they thought that they were near the end of their era. Who knows what the end meant, how soon they thought of that. And certainly in retrospect, after the fall of Tenochtitlan, but when the Europeans arrived, there could be a way of interpreting that through that lens, and it's hard to know how much is retrospect and how much is not. But it's clear that even before the arrival of the Spaniards, there was an understanding that they were towards the end of this fifth sun, this fifth era. And the Mexica believed that their city, Tenochtitlan, played an active and crucial role in these cycles of creation and destruction. And they believed that Tenochtitlan was the center and the navel of sacred space. What's interesting, though, is instead of this being the place that they were from, which is true for so many of the other smaller city-states that I talked about, these regions, this notion of we are the people, we are the origin, we are the original people, and the world was born right here in the center of these sacred ring of mountains and this protective ring of mountains, and everything out there is less ordered, etc. The Mexica came from elsewhere. They came from the north. They came from Aztlan, and arrived at a place that was the navel of the earth, that was the sacred center, but they had to find it. So that's an interesting and a different way of thinking of themselves. Tenochtitlan was an extremely urban place. It had monumental buildings and very well ordered streets, canals, and marketplaces. But all of this order was seen as intimately connected to cosmic and natural order. There was no sense of humans dominating nature in the way that was being expressed by Europeans around the same time as they were building their cities under a different kind of idea about that. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks. On the contrary, there was a deep need for humans to participate in partnership with natural and divine forces to ensure the continuation of life. The building of this city and the ceremonies that went on there were in fact considered part of the human duty to balance these forces of the cosmos, as I've mentioned before. It was believed that the sun and the rain gods gave life to the earth, and it was the duty of the human population that lived on the earth to give back to the sun and the rain gods, and that blood was the gift that was needed to replenish the earth from the loss of this life force that happened. Blood was the sacred substance of life, and so in spilling it, the earth and the sun were regenerated. Human life and blood and the life of all of the universe was intimately tied. And I mentioned this before, but there was an eternal daily struggle between the sun and the moon and the day and the night. And as a result of that struggle, the earth needed blood to regenerate itself. Ceremonial wars were waged by all three of the major cities in the Triple Alliance against subject peoples in the empire to gather subjects for either blood or life sacrifice. And this seemed to also really increase towards the end of the era. So something that is significant is that when the Spaniards arrived, the Mexica, or the Triple Alliance, actually the Aztec Empire, what we came to think of as the Aztec Empire, but the Triple Alliance was already in trouble. They were already experiencing lots of rebellion, and they had increased these wars. The wars had gotten, more and more and more. And it's hard to know, chicken or the egg. Were people rebelling because there was, increased warfare and increased demand for human sacrifice? Or were they doing that because they were already losing their power and they were trying to establish power? Not entirely clear. But by the time the Spanish arrival, it does seem that this practice had accelerated and that the power of the Triple Alliance, particularly the Mexica, was getting shakier and more tenuous. The ceremonial wars were known as flowery wars. And like I said, whether these flowery wars were the cause or the result of the shakiness of their power, scholars argue about this. But there is a kind of general agreement that there is some connection between the end of all of these great states and periods of increasing instability and the increase in human sacrifice. The three most prominent the three most prominent deities, the three most prominent figures of the divine, if you want to call it that, in the Mexica cosmology were Huitzilopochtli, who is the god of the sun, Tlaloc, the rain god that we had mentioned, and of course Quetzalcoatl, the winged serpent. So Huitzilopochtli is the new one that we have not talked about yet. Huitzilopochtli is also a very interesting figure, which maybe some of you want to explore further if you like. I'm not going to go into that very much. Maybe I'll add to it, but I'm not prepared to talk very much about Huitzilopochtli, but Huitzilopochtli is a warring entity and has a kind of controversial origin. So anyways, maybe I think maybe I'll let you, maybe some of you might be interested in researching that. So that is the end of this lecture. I'm going to give another one that talks a little bit more about the concept of the North, and from the perspective of inside and outside and order and chaos and things like that, just a little bit. And then I'm going to do some more things about the Andes. But I'm going to take a break for a little while. And what I'd like for you to do now is, whenever you listen to this lecture, is to stop and write for a little while. Just take 5 minutes. It can be your journal entry if you want. And just reflect on what impressions you have from this whirlwind tour of Mesoamerican cultures. So this lecture or this link and the last link, just think about, what stands out to you. And it doesn't have to be the things that I said stood out to you. What sorts of patterns did you notice? You can also, generate questions for clarification or whatever you want, but I'd like for you to sort of just think about your impressions. What stood out to you? What sorts of continuities, what sorts of connections, what sorts of patterns, what impression do you have of this region before the Spaniards got there from this bunch of information that I just threw you? All right, till the next one.